Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPhone 12 mini and see how this particular iPhone holds up in 2025. Now, I will tell you, the iPhone 12 mini was a very interesting device that Apple made, because this particular phone was actually one of the smallest phones Apple made at that time. And I will still say in a lot of ways, this is still one of those devices that I'd look at. And I still think it's, an interesting device to say the least. There might be one device though that is better than this thing that I would highly recommend people to buy for the most part. And I will recommend that a little bit later. But if you want to pick up any of the phones I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPhone 12 mini, this phone came out about 5 years ago technically if we're looking at the years. It came out in 2020 and this thing on the front side is giving you a 5.4-inch Super Retina XDR OLED display. Now, this panel in and of itself really wasn't a bad panel. And it was actually a really interesting choice by Apple because this was the smallest iPhone they made at the time. It was a very, very small sized iPhone, but they went through and they basically just allowed us to have basically the same size display or the same resolution of the display that we had on previous iPhones on this smaller size. So they didn't really skimp out from that side, which I actually liked a lot. I was really happy that Apple actually ended up doing something like that. So within a phone like this, you're basically going through and getting a pretty good high resolution display. It's not the brightest when compared to, phones nowadays, 1200 nits of brightness, but still it really wasn't like that terrible of a display on this smaller size panel. On the sides of this phone, it was also completely flat-sided, so they didn't skimp out on that side either. It still felt pretty premium when it came down to it from that side too. And you're still going through and you're still maintaining other things. Like this particular phone was giving you a glass back with a dual camera setup, and it was still giving you MagSafe and IP certification and a lot of other stuff like that too, which that might sound like whatever, but when you think about what Apple was basically doing at this time, they were basically going through and making a smaller phone, and they could have skimped out a lot more, but they gave it basically everything that the iPhone 12 was getting, which is very similar to what the iPhone 12 Pro got. So I did actually like that a lot about Apple at this moment. And that was like kind of an interesting thing that kind of ended up happening here for the most part within this type of device. So I will tell you, if you're looking at this type of phone from that side, it was a very interesting thing to say the least. And although this phone isn't perfect, there's definitely some things that this phone is missing out on that a lot of phones basically have nowadays. So number one, you're not getting a 120 hertz display on this phone, which for a phone like this, even for a size like this, it's kind of expected. Like I totally understand it, but you are basically missing that on this particular device. So kind of keep that in mind. On top of that, you're also missing out on things like a higher brightness panel. You're missing out on USB Type-C as well. And actually, USB Type-C is probably one of those things that I would love to have more than anything else. So I definitely do think if I was to go through and pick up a phone, that's the one thing I would miss the most, is basically missing out on USB Type-C. So although, again, not the worst thing in the world, that's just another one of those things to kind of keep in mind there when it kind of comes down to it. Now, on top of that, another thing to keep in mind here too, is that with something like, the iPhone 12 mini, this is one of those devices that you could look at and basically think to yourself, well, this is a much cheaper phone now than it was before. This is about a $200 phone that you can buy as of this point. And that is actually a pretty good price to pay for a phone like this, as you can probably imagine. Like this thing doesn't necessarily cost that much money anymore. Spending $200 on a phone like this could seem like a good deal, but there might be some other phones, particularly one iPhone that might be better than this thing. But from the size perspective, it is actually a really good size to, it's a really, really competitive price and size when you're thinking about this type of phone from that side. So from that side as well, that kind of covers it up there. Now, when it comes down to the camera side of this phone, you're basically going through and basically still maintaining a dual camera setup on the back side. So this phone is still giving you that there, which is still really nice to have. So being able to go through and pick up this type of phone that's going to be giving you like that type of layout is very nice. 12 megapixel camera on the front side as well. So once again, that is in and of itself a really, really nice thing. So I would say from a camera quality standpoint, this thing does do a good job. Although it's not perfect, I think Apple, for the most part, still did a pretty interesting job, to say the least. So if you're going to go through and pick up a phone, this thing is still giving you 4K at 60 on the front and the back. Snapchats and videos and those things are still going to look great. Well, they're going to look good. They're not going to look amazing, but they're still going to be good enough for the most part. So if you're going through and picking up a phone like this, you can be rest assured that a phone like this is still going to be giving you a pretty good experience. The only thing though, if you're going through and if you're picking up a device like this for the most part, you will notice that these types of devices are going to be they won't necessarily be like the best type of experience, just because this type of camera is probably going to be giving you a little bit more of like a lackluster experience when it comes down to like, if you're comparing this thing against like some of the bigger competition, like a Samsung Galaxy S24, an iPhone 16 Pro, those types of cameras, you might experience that those particular devices might be giving you a little bit of a different type of experience in my personal opinion, but I still think this type of lens for the most part is still pretty decent for the most part when it comes down to it. So from that side, that kind of covers it up there too. Now, on top of that, when it comes down to some other areas about this particular device, I think this particular phone still does a pretty good job when it comes down to the whole entire capability, when it specifically comes down to the software longevity. So this phone is still supported with software as of this point, right? It's still giving you software updates. And I do think that in and of itself, it is a nice thing to have. So being able to go through and pick up a phone that's going to be giving you software updates here and there, that's a really nice thing to have. And I think that would kind of change my perspective on a lot of phones nowadays too. Like being able to go through, pick up these types of devices that are going to be giving you very solid experience. That is something that's really, really nice. So kind of keep that in mind if you're going to go through and pick up this type of phone, because this phone is still supported with software. It's still going to be giving you some software updates here and there. Although it's not like a perfect device or anything, I think this thing is still good enough from that particular standpoint. But one of the weirder areas of this phone when it first came out was probably the battery life. Surprisingly, a lot of people were able to get like pretty solid battery life from this thing when it first came out. I would say nowadays though, that might not 100% be the case. Like it's still not terrible, it still turns on and it still works. But I think with the last several updates, there's been some kind of insanity kind of going around. But keep in mind, I do think iOS 18 has gotten a lot better. So that might be one thing to kind of keep in mind here, that the software updates have been getting a little bit better. But still to this day, it might make still a little bit more sense to go and kind of, maybe go a different route. And if you want a device that's going to be giving you better battery life, you could also just swing for something like an iPhone 12 and get a bigger size battery. On top of all those things, when it comes down to the whole entire, performance side of things, this iPhone is giving you an Apple A14 Bionic chip inside of it with 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now, definitely when it comes down to the whole entire performance side, power side, RAM side, this type of phone for the most part, like it's really not terrible, right? Like I've definitely seen worse phones performing than this thing. And that chipset and that amount of RAM is still actually pretty relevant. It still is a pretty good amount of RAM to have inside of a device. And I would still say if you're going to go through and pick up a phone, this thing definitely is not terrible. You can easily make this thing last and easily kind of, get a lot of capability from this device too. So I think this in and of itself is a really, really nice thing. So that is in and of itself good. But, if you're wanting a better phone, then there's a lot of other better options you have here as well. And that's the thing about this type of device. I do feel like the iPhone 12 mini, it's not a bad phone. It's not a terrible phone by any means. But I do think there are some just better options out there. And I feel like an iPhone 13 mini is a really good phone. If you still want to stay and maintain within that smaller design frame, then I definitely do think getting something like this type of device would still make a lot of sense, right? But at the same time, I also feel like an iPhone 13 Pro at the minimum is also a really good option as well. Like you can easily go ahead and buy something like an iPhone 13 Pro and still get a device that's going to be giving you really good capability and really good quality. And it's not really going to be like this crazy, insanely like expensive phone. Like those are also going to be like fairly cheap, fairly good phones that you can also buy as well. And that's kind of the big thing that I'd recommend kind of thinking about, is like that type of device necessarily doesn't really cost that much money. And you can still go and buy a device like that and still get some really good quality too. So in my personal opinion, that's kind of what I would think, right? I feel like these types of devices, those are the ones I'd recommend buying, but those are the choice. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.